Charlotte Hayes pressed her palm flat against the kitchen table and did not cry. Not when her father read the letter aloud. Not when her sister Eleanor shrieked with delight and began calculating which gown to wear. Not even when her mother reached across and squeezed her hand with an apology in her eyes that no one dared speak aloud. She simply lifted her chin, folded the linen cloth beside the bread basket, and said quietly, "Then I suppose someone ought to make sure the house is fit to receive him." If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1817 arrived at the Hayes estate without mercy. The heat came early, pressing down on the dry Virginia fields like a hand had no intention of lifting. The well at the east corner of the property had run low by June. 2 of the farmhands had already left for better pay elsewhere. The kitchen roof had developed a leak that Charlotte had patched 3 times herself using strips of oilcloth she'd cut from an old trunk cover, and every morning she woke before dawn to check whether it had held through the night. She was 24 years old, and she ran this household the way a ship's captain runs a vessel taking on water with precision, without panic, and with the constant quiet knowledge that one wrong move could sink everything. Her father, Sir Richard Hayes, was a man who had once been impressive. He had the kind of face that inspired confidence in other men. Square jaw, steady eyes, a voice that carried across a room without effort. But debt had a way of hollowing a man out, and Richard Hayes had been hollowing for the better part of 3 years. He spent most mornings in his study with the door closed, and most evenings staring into a glass of bourbon he didn't finish. He did not discuss finances with Charlotte. He did not discuss finances with anyone. That was, Charlotte had long since understood precisely the problem. Her mother, Lady Marjorie Hayes, was a gentle woman, stretched thin by anxiety. She hummed to herself when she was frightened, a low, tuneless sound that Charlotte had learned to listen for the way a farmer listens for distant thunder. Marjorie Hayes hummed a great deal these days. And then there was Eleanor. Eleanor Hayes was 19, beautiful in the way that demanded acknowledgement, and entirely convinced that the universe had designed itself around her particular preferences. She had copper-colored hair that she spent 40 minutes arranging each morning. She had opinions about French lace, and the correct way to enter a ballroom, and the inferior character of every eligible man within 30 miles who had not yet formally pursued her. She was not cruel exactly. She was simply so thoroughly occupied with her own brightness that she rarely noticed anyone standing in her shadow. Charlotte had long ago stopped minding the shadow. She had simply learned to work in it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Charlotte was in the kitchen when Thomas, their one remaining house servant, brought it in. He held it the way people hold things they're uncertain about, at arm's length, slightly tilted, as if it might change its mind about its own contents. The seal was dark blue wax, stamped with an emblem Charlotte didn't immediately recognize, a hawk and profile wings folded. "For your father," Thomas said. "Rider came from the North Road. Didn't stop for water." Charlotte dried her hands on the cloth at her waist, and looked at the letter without touching it. Something about the weight of it, the quality of the paper, the precision of the seal, told her it was not the kind of letter that brought ordinary news. "Take it to him," she said. She went back to the bread dough she'd been working. 20 minutes later, her father's voice rose through the floorboards. Not in anger. In something more complicated than anger, a sound that was halfway between relief and the particular shame of a man who has run out of alternatives. Charlotte set down the dough and washed her hands a second time and went upstairs. Her father was standing behind his desk. Her mother was seated near the window, already humming. Eleanor was standing in the center of the room, holding the letter with both hands, her eyes moving back and forth across the page with an expression of rapidly accelerating delight. "Charlotte," her father said. He did not look directly at her. "Shut the door." She shut the door. "Mr. Jonathan Carrington has made a formal proposal," her father said. "He will settle the estate debt in full, clear the liens on the north fields, restore the household account to standing." He cleared his throat. "In exchange for the hand of one of my daughters in marriage." The room was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "One of us," Charlotte said. "Not a question, a measurement. He's left the choice open. her mother said, and the humming stopped entirely, which was somehow worse. He says he wishes to visit first, to meet the family. Eleanor lowered the letter and looked up with an expression Charlotte recognized immediately. It was the look her sister wore when she had already decided something and was merely performing the courtesy of appearing to consider other possibilities. "He's worth $40,000 a year," Eleanor said. "At minimum. He owns the Carrington land up past the Shenandoah line. That's 3 estates. He winters in Boston." She folded the letter along its existing crease, neat and proprietary. "I shall wear the green silk." "Eleanor," their mother said quietly, "Mama, be practical." Eleanor set the letter on the desk with a small definitive sound. "Charlotte doesn't want this sort of thing. She's never wanted a grand marriage. She's perfectly content managing the household and—" "I haven't said what I want," Charlotte said. Her voice was level. It was always level. People sometimes mistook that levelness for indifference, and she had never gone out of her way to correct them. "And you haven't been asked." Eleanor blinked. Then she smiled the particular smile she used when she felt she had the superior position and could afford to be gracious. "Of course, darling. No one's decided anything." Charlotte looked at her father. "When does he come?" 2 weeks. Then we have work to do." She picked up the letter from the desk. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, read it through once, and set it back down. "The east guest rooms need airing. The front path wants re-graveling. If he's riding from the north road, he'll see the east fence line first, and 3 of those posts are rotted through." She looked at her mother. "I'll need money for gravel." "Charlotte," her father began. "We're being evaluated, Father," she said quietly. "The least we can do is make a decent accounting of ourselves." She walked out of the room and went back down to the kitchen and the bread dough, and she did not think about the letter again that night. Instead, she made a list in her head in order of urgency, the way she always did when the ground shifted under her feet. East fence posts, guest room linens, the leak in the south corridor ceiling, provisions for a guest of quality. Her own composure, which would require no money at all but considerably more effort than the fence posts. She worked through the list while her hands moved through the dough, pressing and folding until the kitchen smelled of yeast and the morning light came through the window in long flat lines across the stone floor. No. Jonathan Carrington arrived on a Thursday, but not in the way anyone expected. Eleanor had spent the better part of 2 weeks preparing for his arrival, as if preparing for a theatrical performance in which she was simultaneously the lead actress, the director, and the audience most worth impressing. She had her green silk pressed. She had rehearsed a series of remarks designed to appear spontaneous. She had positioned herself to be visible from the front drive at the precise angle she'd determined was most flattering. The problem was that Jonathan Carrington did not come up the front drive. He came in from the east road, on a horse that was good but not showy, wearing a coat that was clean but plainly cut with no retinue and no calling card sent ahead. He rode up to the stable yard and swung down from the saddle without ceremony, and looked around with the unhurried attention of a man cataloging what he saw. Charlotte was in the stable yard. She had been up since before dawn dealing with a complicated situation involving the Hayes' one remaining cart horse, a loose shoe, and the fact that the farrier they usually called had sent word that morning that he was occupied elsewhere and could not come until the following week. She had, after approximately 10 minutes of deliberation, decided to address the problem herself. She had reshod horses before her father's head stableman had taught her the basics when she was 16. Reasoning that a young woman who managed a household ought to understand everything that household depended on. She was crouched beside the horse's left foreleg with a rasp in her hand and her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a smear of something dark across her left cheekbone when the stranger walked into the yard. She looked up. He was tall, not dramatically so, but with the kind of height that came with a natural authority of posture. Gray eyes. A face that gave away very little. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, which was unusual for Charlotte, who was generally good at reading expressions. "Ma'am," he said. He took his hat off. "I apologize for coming in the back way. I wasn't certain of the road. "It's a reasonable road," she said. "You're the second entrance on the left if you wanted the front." "I reckon I found what I needed." He glanced at the horse, then back at her. "You're doing that yourself. The farrier's unavailable. Would you like help?" She looked at him for a moment. He was not dressed like a man who regularly helped with farrier work. But his hands, she noticed, were not the soft hands of a man who only ever signed documents. "Have you done it before?" she asked. "Some." "Then yes," she said. "Hold his head. He startles on the left side." The man moved to the horse's head without hesitation, murmuring something low and even near the animal's ear that had an immediate settling effect. Charlotte went back to work. They worked in silence for a while. He held the horse steady, and she rasped and fitted and nailed with the focused economy of someone who knows exactly how much effort each task requires and wastes none. "You're a Hayes," he said after a while. "Charlotte Hayes," she said without looking up. "Is the family well enough?" She straightened and tested the shoe with 2 sharp taps. Solid. She moved to the hind quarter. "You're not from around here?" "No, ma'am." "Passing through?" A pause. "Something like that." She asked him nothing further. She had a general policy about asking strangers too many questions. It invited reciprocal inquiries she sometimes didn't have the patience to navigate, and she was focused. The work required focus. By the time she finished, she had a faint awareness that he'd been watching her more than the horse for the last quarter hour. She was accustomed to being looked at in assessment. She was the sort of woman who got assessed rather than admired, and she was accustomed to people eventually losing interest once they'd determined she was competent but unremarkable. He did not appear to lose interest. "Thank you," she said, standing and wiping her hands on the cloth at her waist. "For the help." "I enjoyed it," he said, and he sounded as though he meant it in a way that was not entirely about the horse. She studied him for a moment. There was something about the way he carried himself, not like a man passing through. Like a man taking inventory. "Will you be staying in the area long?" she asked. "A while," he said. "I have some business." "Then you might want the inn on the Cromwell Road," she said. "Mrs. Hewitt keeps a clean house. Tell her Charlotte Hayes sent you, and she'll give you the good room." He looked at her then fully the way people rarely looked at Charlotte, because they were generally too busy looking at Eleanor. "I appreciate that, Miss Hayes," he said. He put his hat back on, and inclined his head, an old-fashioned gesture, the kind that belonged to a different kind of man than his plain coat suggested. "I'll remember your kindness." He walked back out through the gate, and she watched him go, and then went to wash her hands at the pump. She thought briefly that there was something familiar about the way he'd held the horse's head. Something practiced. Something that belonged to a man who knew animals and labor and patience. Not a man passing through. She filed the thought away and went to start dinner. Eleanor had the green silk on by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Jonathan Carrington sent a formal calling card to the front door at 4:30, introducing himself by name and requesting the pleasure of the family's company at dinner the following evening. Marjorie Hayes read the card and made a sound of distressed excitement. Richard Hayes sat down in his chair heavily and poured 2 fingers of bourbon and then didn't touch it. Eleanor took the card from her mother's hand and read it, and then looked at Charlotte across the room with an expression that combined triumph, condescension, and the faintest edge of something that might in a different woman have been nervousness. "Jonathan Carrington," Eleanor read aloud, "of Carrington Hall, Shenandoah County." She set the card down with a precise little click. "I told you he was coming." "He came this morning," Charlotte said. Eleanor blinked. "What?" "He came in through the east yard this morning, around 9. The room was quiet in a very particular way. "You met him," Eleanor said. Her voice had gone careful. "He helped me shoe the cart horse." The silence that followed was the kind that has several different layers moving in different directions at once. Her father looked up from the bourbon. Her mother's humming began very softly and then stopped. Eleanor stood absolutely still, which was something she almost never did. "You let him—" Eleanor started. "He offered," Charlotte said. "He was competent, The horse needed shoeing. She looked at her father. He's staying at the Cromwell Road Inn. He has good hands, and he's quieter than you'd expect for a man of his position, if that's what he is. What do you mean if that's what he is? Her father said. Charlotte considered the gray eyes and the old-fashioned inclination of the head, and the way he'd said, "I'll remember your kindness. I mean, he'll be worth watching closely at dinner tomorrow," she said. She went back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Eleanor say something to her mother in a low, sharp voice, and her mother's reply was too quiet to make out, and then the humming started again. Dinner the following evening was its own kind of theater. Eleanor arrived in the green silk at precisely the right moment, framed by the parlor doorway at the precise angle she'd calculated. She was objectively radiant. She had the kind of beauty that made rooms rearrange themselves. People shifted, straightened, turned toward her the way sunflowers turn without choosing to. Jonathan Carrington stood when she entered the way good manners required. He was watching her the way a man watches a fire, aware of it, respectful of it, but not in danger of being burned. Charlotte came in 3 minutes later, having just dealt with a small crisis in the kitchen involving a sauce that had broken and required rescuing. She had a clean dress on and her hair pinned back, and she was approximately 6 degrees less formally presented than Eleanor, and she had made her peace with this years ago. Jonathan Carrington's gaze moved to her across the room and did not move away. She met his eyes, and something passed between them that she didn't fully understand. A recognition, maybe, or the beginning of one. And then she went to speak to her father, and the evening arranged itself around the table. Eleanor performed beautifully. She spoke of music and society and the appropriate subjects of cultivated conversation. She laughed at the right moments. She turned the conversation toward Carrington's estates and fortune, and standing with the skilled indirection of a woman who has practiced the maneuver extensively. Jonathan Carrington was polite, attentive, and revealed almost nothing. He asked Charlotte one question all evening. He asked it during a moment when Eleanor had turned to speak to Marjorie, and Richard Hayes had left the table briefly, and it was only the two of them momentarily in the room's attention. "The shoe held," he said quietly. Charlotte looked at him. "It held," she said. "Thank you again for your help." "You didn't need it." "No," she said honestly, "but it was faster with 2 people." He looked at her with those gray eyes and said nothing for a moment, and then Eleanor's laugh from across the table pulled the room's attention back, and the moment closed. But Charlotte thought about it afterward, lying awake in the heat of the summer night, with the window open and the sound of the crickets filling the dark. He'd said, "You didn't need it." Most men said nothing at all, or said that's no work for a woman. A handful, the polite ones, said how remarkable. None of them had ever simply observed the fact of her competence as though it were neither surprising nor noteworthy, but simply quietly true. She lay in the dark and listened to the crickets, and thought that Jonathan Carrington was a man who was watching all of them very carefully, and that whatever he was watching for, it wasn't green silk. She was not certain what that meant. She was not certain yet that she wanted to find out, but she was, for the first time in a very long while, curious. And Charlotte Hayes, who had trained herself out of most unnecessary emotions, found that curiosity was the one she had never quite managed to let go. He had been in the county for 4 days before anyone figured out who he was. That was, Charlotte later understood, entirely intentional. She found out the same way she found out most things, not from being told, but from paying attention. She was at the dry goods store on the Cromwell Road Wednesday morning, pricing out what it would cost to replace the kitchen's cracked water basin, when she overheard 2 women talking in low, delighted voices near the back shelf. She recognized one of them. Mrs. Alderton, wife of the county land assessor, a woman who treated information the way other people treated currency. Carefully accumulated, strategically spent. "Carrington," Mrs. Alderton was saying. "Jonathan Carrington, the one from Shenandoah. 40,000 a year, they say, and the haul unentailed." Charlotte set down the basin she'd been examining. "And he's staying at the inn," the other woman said. "Without a valet, without a single servant. Deliberately, I expect." Mrs. Alderton's voice dropped to the tone reserved for intelligence of particular value. "They say he does it. Goes somewhere new and lets people think he's ordinary. Sees how they treat an ordinary man. She paused. The Hayes family of all the luck. Charlotte picked up the basin again and looked at the price as though she had not heard a single word. She bought the basin. She walked back to the cart. She sat with the reins in her hands for a solid 30 seconds before she clicked the horse forward. He'd said, "I have some business." He'd let her send him to the Cromwell Road Inn. He'd held her horse's head and said you didn't need it, and watched her across a dinner table and asked whether the shoe held, and the entire time he'd known exactly who she was, while she'd had no idea who he was. She was not certain whether to be impressed or irritated. She settled provisionally on both. When she got home, Eleanor was sitting in the front parlor with their mother, and the moment Charlotte walked in, Eleanor looked up with an expression that told her Eleanor already knew. "You didn't tell me he helped you in the stable yard," Eleanor said. Charlotte set her purchases on the hall table. "You didn't ask, Charlotte." The word was carefully controlled. "That was my first impression. That was his first impression of this family, and you were—" Eleanor's hand moved briefly toward Charlotte's general direction, indicating the totality of her, the work dress and pinned-back hair and no-nonsense posture. "You were in the yard." "The horse needed shoeing," Charlotte said. "There will be other horses." There was only the one that day. Eleanor stood up. She was taller than Charlotte by 2 inches, and she used those inches with long-practiced fluency. "I need you to understand what is at stake here. Not just for me. For all of us. For Father." Her voice tightened on the last word in a way that was Charlotte acknowledged privately, not entirely calculated. There was genuine worry in it. "He is going to choose one of us. And it would be better for everyone if he chose correctly." "You mean if he chooses you?" Charlotte said. "I mean if he chooses the right person." Eleanor held her gaze. "You know I'm right, Charlotte. You've never wanted this kind of life. You would be miserable in Boston society. You would hate the dinners and the calls, and you would hate all of it." Charlotte looked at her sister for a long moment. Eleanor was not entirely wrong. Charlotte had never spent much time dreaming about grand drawing rooms and formal calling schedules. She had spent her time keeping the roof from leaking and the household accounts from collapsing, and she had until approximately 48 hours ago assumed that her future would involve continuing to do exactly that in one form or another. "You may be right," Charlotte said, "but that isn't your decision to make." She picked up her purchases and went to the kitchen. Behind her, the silence had an edge to it she hadn't heard from Eleanor in a long time. Jonathan Carrington came to call again on Thursday afternoon. He came correctly this time, front road formal calling card, sent ahead arriving at the appointed hour, in a coat that was still plain but noticeably better cut than the one he'd worn to the stable yard. He had a way of sitting in a parlor chair that suggested he was mildly tolerant of parlors as a concept, but was willing to engage with them on their own terms. Eleanor had repositioned herself 3 times in the 20 minutes before he arrived. She was now in the chair that caught the best light, wearing a day dress the precise color of morning sky, her copper hair arranged to its best advantage. She was also, Charlotte noticed, more nervous than she'd seen her in years. A fine, controlled nervousness that showed only in the slight stillness of her hands, which Eleanor always kept very animated when she felt secure. Richard Hayes sat across from Carrington and conducted himself with the particular dignity of a man who knows he is being observed during a transaction and intends to make the best appearance the circumstances allow. He spoke of the estate, the land, the prospects of the county. He was careful not to mention the debt directly. Carrington listened and asked precise questions, and the debt's presence filled the room the way smoke fills a room not visible but known. Charlotte sat to the side and said very little and watched Carrington the way she'd learned to watch anything that mattered. He asked Eleanor about Boston. Eleanor spoke beautifully about Boston. He asked her whether she enjoyed management of a large household. Eleanor spoke slightly less beautifully about that pivoting with skill toward the social aspects of a well-run establishment, the dinners, the guests, the standing in community. Carrington nodded, and his face revealed approximately nothing. Then he looked at Charlotte. "Miss Hayes," he said, Your father tells me you've managed this estate for the past 3 years. Richard Hayes made a small, uncomfortable movement. Charlotte assists. She manages, Carrington said. It was not rude. It was simply accurate, and he said it the way he said most things, quietly, without apology. The room rearranged itself around that sentence. I do what's necessary, Charlotte said. The east fence line was reposted this week, he said. I noticed riding in. 2 of the posts were rotted through. You did it yourself. Thomas helped with the digging. Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise, she thought. More like confirmation. The Hadley property 2 miles north let their fence line go for 2 seasons, he said. They lost 12 head of cattle through the gap last spring. I'm aware, Charlotte said. That's why I fixed ours. Across the room, Eleanor had gone very still with her beautifully arranged hands. Carrington looked at Charlotte for a moment longer than was strictly conversational, and then he turned back to Richard Hayes and the conversation moved on. But Charlotte was aware, with a clarity she couldn't entirely account for, that something had shifted. She did not look at Eleanor. She didn't need to. She could feel her sister's attention, the way you feel. Heat, a directed, concentrated warmth, with a complicated temperature. He left after an hour. Eleanor waited until the sound of his horse faded down the front road, and then she turned to Charlotte with an expression that had moved beyond careful control into something raw. You did that deliberately, Eleanor said. I answered his question, Charlotte said. You answered it in a way that was designed to... Eleanor stopped, started again. You made me look decorative. You are decorative, Eleanor. Charlotte meant it without cruelty. You are also clever and charming and genuinely suited to the kind of life he can offer. None of that stopped being true because I fixed a fence. He looked at you, Eleanor said. He kept looking at you. Charlotte didn't answer because she had nothing useful to say to that. Charlotte? Eleanor's voice had dropped. Please, I need this. I know you think I only want the money and the position, but I... She stopped again, and something in her face that was rarely visible came briefly to the surface. I want to be somewhere safe. I want to stop being afraid about whether the roof will hold. I want... Her voice broke very slightly, the way a door breaks when the frame has warped a small sound, but one that reveals pressure you hadn't known was there. I want a life that doesn't feel like it's one bad season from collapse. Charlotte looked at her sister for a long moment. The truth was that Eleanor and Charlotte were afraid of exactly the same thing. They just handled it differently. Eleanor handled it by arranging herself beautifully and pointing herself toward the best available exit. Charlotte handled it by fixing the fence. I haven't done anything to stand in your way, Charlotte said quietly. And I don't intend to. Eleanor looked at her with something that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, but was somewhere in that territory. Just let me have the conversations with him, Eleanor said. Let me be the one he sees. Charlotte thought about gray eyes that had watched her across the dinner table and asked whether the shoe held. All right, she said. She meant it when she said it. She was not certain even then that it would be enough. The social call that changed everything happened on Saturday. Mrs. Alderton gave a small summer gathering, the kind that was called informal and was anything but. And the Hayes family attended, along with approximately every family of standing within a 12-mile radius who had somehow become aware that Jonathan Carrington would be present. The drawing room at Alderton House was warm and buzzing with the particular frequency of collective social calculation. Eleanor wore ivory and gold and was objectively the most beautiful woman in the room. Charlotte wore blue and stood near the window and made quiet conversation with old Dr. Marsh about the drought's effect on well levels, which was a subject she knew well and found genuinely interesting. She was not trying to hide. She was simply being where she naturally came to rest in a room full of people. Carrington found her there. He came to stand beside her with a glass he wasn't drinking from, and she understood from the set of his shoulders that he was using her general location as a reason to be away from the center of the room, which was pulling at him from all directions. Dr. Marsh, Carrington said with a nod. Mr. Carrington? The old doctor shook his hand, with the uncalculating warmth of a man who'd never spent a day performing for social advancement. "We were discussing the drought. You've come from the Shenandoah country. How are the wells up that way?" "Low," Carrington said. "We rerouted a secondary creek to the south pasture in May. Bought us some time." "Practical solution," Charlotte said. He looked at her. "It was your father's former foreman, actually, Hale. He worked for us 3 years ago before he retired." Charlotte felt the information land. Hale had worked for the Hayes estate before her father's finances had made keeping experienced staff impossible. She had been 17 when Hale left. She had always thought it was simply bad luck, the way she thought of most of the estate's losses. In those years, a gradual erosion of good things that she had not yet had the skill to prevent. "I didn't know where he'd gone," she said. "He spoke of this place," Carrington said. "Spoke well of it." He paused. "Spoke well of you, in fact. Said there was one of the Hayes children who understood that land doesn't forgive being ignored." Charlotte absorbed that. "He was kind." "He was accurate," Carrington said. "There's a difference." Dr. Marsh excused himself with the tactful instinct of a man who has lived long enough to recognize a conversation that wants to become a different kind of conversation. Charlotte and Carrington stood near the window, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You knew who I was," Charlotte said. "In the stable yard." "I suspected," he said. "The calling card confirmed it." "You didn't say." "No." He turned his glass in his hand. "I wanted to see what you were like when you didn't know you were being evaluated." The directness of it startled her, not because it was unkind, but because it was so thoroughly honest. She was accustomed to men who softened or strategized. He simply said the thing. "And what did you conclude?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "That you are competent, unsentimental, and more than a little exhausted." She felt something shift in her chest, a small, complicated loosening. "That's a frank assessment." "You prefer honest to flattering, I think." "I prefer accurate," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like a door opening a fraction. "There's a difference," he said, and he used her own word back at her with a precision she recognized as entirely deliberate. From across the room, she was aware of Eleanor watching them with that concentrated, complicated heat. She was also aware that she had just told Jonathan Carrington, in effect, though neither of them had said the thing plainly, that she was not indifferent to him. She did not know what to do with that. She had not expected to have to figure it out. She excused herself a moment later and went to get a glass of water she didn't need, and she stood near the back table and thought with considerable urgency about what Eleanor had asked of her 3 days ago. "Let me be the one he sees." The problem Charlotte was realizing with a quiet, inconvenient precision was that she had not been trying to be seen. And he was finding her anyway. Soma. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She told herself this with the same focused discipline she used on every other problem that didn't want to be managed, and it worked about as well as it usually did when she applied it to things that weren't strictly speaking. Problems of the kind that yielded to management. She fixed 2 more things on the estate that week. She reorganized the kitchen stores. She re-lettered the account book she'd been keeping and brought it fully current. She told herself she was simply doing what needed to be done, which was true, and she told herself she was absolutely not thinking about a man with gray eyes and an honest mouth, which was less true. Eleanor, for her part, was conducting her campaign with considerable intelligence. She was present at every opportunity. She was charming, without being obvious about it. She had a real conversation with Carrington about property management. She'd done her research, Charlotte noted, and while her knowledge was newly acquired and somewhat theoretical, she delivered it with enough conviction and energy that it landed well. She was working hard and working honestly, and Charlotte found she genuinely respected it. She also genuinely respected that Eleanor had not said another word to her about stepping back. The unspoken arrangement held. Until Sunday evening, when Charlotte was coming in from checking the south fence and nearly walked into Jonathan Carrington standing in the kitchen garden. She stopped. He stopped. They looked at each other in the fading summer light. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Mr. Carrington." She looked past him toward the house. "Were you expected this evening?" "No," he said. "I was riding past and I—" He stopped. She noticed the expression of a man who has caught himself in a sentence he hadn't fully planned. "I was riding past," he said again, with a slight note of irony she thought was directed at himself. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "The kitchen garden is not generally on the Cromwell Road," she said. "No," he agreed, "it is not." The evening air sat between them warm and still, full of the sound of cicadas and the smell of dry earth. "Charlotte," he said. Her first name, not Miss Hayes. She felt the shift of it. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I'd rather say it plainly than let it continue to be the thing that is not being said." She waited. She was very good at waiting. "I came here to make a practical arrangement," he said. "For practical reasons. My estate needs management. My tenants need someone who understands what a household requires. I came expecting to find—" He stopped. "I came expecting to evaluate 2 young women of suitable family and select the more appropriate one and conduct the whole matter with the kind of efficiency that practical arrangements generally allow." "And," she said, "and I reshod a horse with you on a Tuesday morning," he said, "and watched you fix a fence line and save a sauce and hold a room together without anyone noticing you were doing it." He held her gaze. "And I find that my practical evaluation has become considerably less practical." The cicadas continued their indifferent chorus. Charlotte Hayes stood in her kitchen garden in the fading summer evening and felt the full weight of what he was telling her, and felt also beneath it, complicated by it, the memory of her sister's voice breaking. "I want a life that doesn't feel like it's one bad season from collapse." "Mr. Carrington," she said carefully, "my sister, is charming and bright and would manage a social calendar beautifully," he said. "She is also not you." The directness of it hit her like cold water. Not unpleasant, simply much. "You are asking me something without asking me," she said. "I am telling you something," he said. "What you do with it is yours to decide." She looked at him in the last of the evening light. She thought about practical arrangements and practical reasons, and the way she had spent 3 years keeping this household standing through the sheer force of attention and refusal to look away from hard things. She thought about Eleanor's copper hair and carefully arranged hands and the genuine fear underneath the vanity, "I want to stop being afraid." She thought about gray eyes and an honest mouth and a man who had said, "You didn't need it," like it was simply a fact about her that he'd noticed and respected. She did not answer him. Not that evening. She said, "Good night, Mr. Carrington." And she went inside and she sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time, and the cicadas sang on outside, and the house creaked and settled around her the way it always did, familiar and worn and hers. And Charlotte Hayes, who had trained herself out of most unnecessary things, sat in the dark and felt the full, inconvenient, complicated truth of her own heart, and did not look away from it, because that at least was one hard thing she had always known how to face. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the heat with the window open and thought about the word practical. The way you think about a word that has been used so many times, it has started to wear thin in the middle. And she thought about Eleanor, and she thought about gray eyes in a kitchen garden, and at some point before dawn, she made a decision. The decision was this: she would do nothing. She would not encourage him. She would not seek him out. She would not allow the conversation in the kitchen garden to become anything other than what it technically was: a man saying a thing, a woman hearing it, no promises made in either direction. Eleanor had asked her for one thing. One thing. And Charlotte Hayes had never in her life been the kind of woman who took things that weren't offered to her. She held to this decision with both hands through Monday morning. It lasted until approximately 10 o'clock, when Eleanor came downstairs with a letter. Not Carrington's letter. This one had a different seal, the Hayes family's own solicitor, a man named Briggs, who operated out of Richmond and communicated in the dry, airless language of financial reckoning. Charlotte recognized the seal before Eleanor had crossed the room and felt something cold move through her. "Father left it on the hall table," Eleanor said. She held it out. Not to their father, to Charlotte. Because Charlotte was the one who read the difficult letters. She always had been. Charlotte opened it. She read it twice, which was one more time than she usually needed. Briggs was informing Richard Hayes that the note held by a creditor named Hollis Crane, a name Charlotte knew, a man she had met once and disliked on instinct, had been sold to a third party. The new holder was demanding full settlement within 60 days or would proceed to legal claim on the North Fields. The North Fields were not just land. They were the only piece of the estate that still produced enough income to keep the household functioning at any level. Losing the North Fields would not just wound the estate, it would end it. 60 days. Carrington's arrangement settlement of the debt in exchange for marriage suddenly had an expiration date that no one had known about 2 weeks ago. Charlotte folded the letter and set it on the table with a flat, careful movement. "How bad?" Eleanor asked. She was watching Charlotte's face with an attention that was sharper than her usual manner, stripped down real. "Bad enough," Charlotte said. 60 days. Eleanor sat down. She did not speak for a moment. She pressed her lips together and looked at the wall, and Charlotte watched her do the arithmetic the same way Charlotte had just done it, arriving at the same answer. "Then there is no more time," Eleanor said quietly. "No," Charlotte said. "There isn't." Eleanor looked at her then directly fully in a way that had very little performance in it. "Charlotte, whatever happened in the garden last night?" "Nothing happened." "Charlotte." She met her sister's eyes. "He is going to offer for you," Eleanor said. "We both know it. It is written in every conversation, every time he crosses a room, every question he is asked and not asked." Her voice was even. It was costing her to keep it even. "I need to know if you will accept." Charlotte held her sister's gaze for a long time. "I told you I wouldn't stand in your way," she said. "That isn't what I asked." The kitchen was very quiet. "No," Charlotte said finally. "I don't know." Eleanor looked at her with an expression Charlotte had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not calculation, but something close to grief and close to acceptance, the way two things that shouldn't coexist sometimes find a way to occupy the same space. "Then I need you to know something," Eleanor said. "If you want him truly, want him, not just feel obligated to step aside for me, then I will not stand in your way either." She stood up. Her hands were very still. "But I need you to decide, because I cannot spend 60 days competing with someone who isn't actually competing." She left the room. Charlotte sat at the table with the letter from Briggs and the weight of a decision she had been trying not to make since Sunday evening, and she understood with the particular clarity that only arrives when you run out of room to avoid a thing that not deciding was itself a decision. She went to find her father. He was in the study, which she'd expected. He was standing at the window, which she hadn't. He usually sat behind the desk for difficult mornings as though the furniture offered protection. Standing at the window meant he'd already moved past the desk's comfort. "You read it," he said without turning. "Yes." He was quiet. The silence had a specific quality. Not the silence of a man who has nothing to say, but the silence of a man who has too much and doesn't know where to begin. "Crane sold the note," he said. "I didn't know he could do that. Briggs should have told me." "Briggs told you in March," Charlotte said gently. "You didn't read that letter either." Her father's shoulders moved, not defensively, more like a man accepting a blow he'd known was coming. "No," he said. "I suppose I didn't." Charlotte sat down in the chair across from the desk, even though he was at the window, and she looked at her hands for a moment before she looked back at him. "Father," she said, "I need to ask you something directly." "All right." "Did you know when you agreed to Carrington's terms that Crane's note had a 60-day clause?" He turned from the window. His face told her the answer before his mouth did. It was not guilt exactly. It was the expression of a man who had chosen not to know something because knowing it would have required him to act. "I knew it was complicated," he said. "That isn't what I asked." He sat down heavily in the desk chair. "Crane mentioned it. In passing. I thought I hoped the situation would resolve before it became relevant." Charlotte absorbed this. So Carrington's offer of settlement was not optional. she said. It was the only thing standing between us and losing the North Fields in 60 days. Yes, her father said, very quietly. And you let Eleanor believe she had time. Let her believe she was being courted in the ordinary way. Let her invest herself in the possibility that she was the one he'd choose. Charlotte kept her voice level. She was very good at keeping her voice level when the alternative would have served no one. Without telling her that any delay, any prolonged courtship, any second thoughts on his part could cost us everything. Her father looked at his hands. I thought Eleanor would charm him quickly, he said. She's always been the one people notice. Charlotte thought about that. She thought about 17-year-old Charlotte learning to shoe a horse from Hale because someone had to, and Eleanor at 15 learning to enter a room from their mother, because that was the currency their world trafficked in, and two daughters shaped by the same household into entirely different tools for the same survival. I see, Charlotte said. She stood up. Charlotte, I'm not angry with you, Father. She meant it. I'm just clear now about what this is. She walked out of the study, and she stood in the hallway for a moment with her back against the wall, and she breathed. 60 days. A creditor circling. A man in a kitchen garden who had looked at her and said, I find that my practical evaluation has become considerably less practical. And Eleanor, who wanted to stop being afraid. Charlotte pushed off the wall and went to the kitchen and put water on to boil because she needed to do something with her hands. And while she waited, she thought about the one thing she had not let herself think about since Sunday night, which was the question of what she actually wanted. Not what the estate needed, not what Eleanor needed, not what her father needed, what Charlotte Hayes, 24 years old and bone-tired and quietly stubbornly alive, actually wanted. The water came to a boil. She wanted the Northfields to hold. She wanted her mother to stop humming out of fear. She wanted Eleanor to have a life that didn't feel like it was one bad season from collapse. Those were Eleanor's own words, and they were Charlotte's too, if she was honest. And she pressed her hand flat on the kitchen table the way she had the day the first letter came, and she made herself finish the thought. She wanted to know what it would be like to be seen. Accurately, honestly, without any performance required by a man who understood the difference between not needing help and not wanting company. She picked up the kettle and poured the water, and she made a decision that was not really a decision so much as an acknowledgement of the thing she had already decided in the kitchen garden and had been refusing to look at directly. She was going to stop stepping back, not out of competition with Eleanor, not out of desperation about the debt, but because Charlotte Hayes had spent 3 years holding this household together through sheer refusal to look away from hard things, and she was not going to look away from this one. She sought Carrington out. She sent a note to the improper formal requesting a brief meeting the following morning on a matter of household business. She kept it exactly that official. She was not going to ambush the man in a garden. She was going to do this the way she did everything, which was directly. He arrived at 9. He came in through the front door this time. Thomas showed him to the small sitting room off the hall, not the parlor where Eleanor had positioned herself so many times, and Charlotte was already there seated with 2 cups of tea she'd poured herself. He sat down across from her. Miss Hayes, he said. Mr. Carrington, she said. I'll be direct. I'd prefer it. My family's situation is more urgent than you may know. She told him about the letter from Briggs, the 60-day clause, the Northfields. She told him plainly and without embellishment, and she watched his face while she did. He did not look surprised. He looked settled, like a man who had received information he'd already calculated for. I know about Crane, he said. She stopped. You know, she said. I bought the note, he said. The sitting room was very quiet. Charlotte looked at Jonathan Carrington across 2 cups of tea she'd poured herself, and understood in one clean, complete, somewhat dizzying moment that the letter from Briggs had not been from a stranger at all. You bought Crane's note, she said carefully, before you came here. Yes. So the 60-day pressure was already mine to extend or enforce, he said. I had no intention of enforcing it, but I wanted to know. He stopped. His jaw tightened briefly. I wanted to know if your father would tell his daughters the truth about the urgency, or whether he would let them proceed in ignorance." "He let us proceed in ignorance," Charlotte said. "Yes," Carrington said. "He did." The information rearranged itself inside her piece by piece into a shape she hadn't expected. "So you have had control of this situation from the beginning," she said. "From before you arrived." "Financially, yes. That is considerable leverage. I haven't used it as leverage. You're using it now." Her voice was level. Her hands were flat on her knees. "Whether you intend to or not, you're using it now because you're sitting in my house telling me you own my family's debt, and I am sitting across from you having come here to—" She stopped. He waited. She looked at him. "I came here to tell you that I would not step aside," she said. "That I had decided, regardless of Eleanor, regardless of what my family needs, that I wanted to speak for myself. And now I learn that the ground I thought I was standing on has been yours this whole time." Carrington leaned forward. He set down his teacup with a careful, deliberate movement. "Charlotte," he said, "not Miss Hayes, her name the way he'd used it in the garden. I bought that note because I intended to settle it regardless of the outcome of this visit. If I had met this family and concluded that neither daughter suited, I would have settled it anyway and called it a charitable act and gone home." He held her gaze without flinching. "I did not use it as leverage to compel a particular answer from you. I used it as information about your father's character. That's all." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are going to have to be very honest with me," she said. "For a very long time if you intend to. If this goes where you appear to intend it to go. Because I do not handle dishonesty by omission any better than I handle the direct kind." "I know," he said. "You've known me 2 weeks." "I know," he said again. "I know anyway." She stood up, not in anger. She needed to stand because sitting felt too passive for the size of what was happening. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking out at the dry fields and the reposted fence line she'd fixed with her own hands. Behind her, she heard him stand too. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Charlotte." He used both the formal and the real. "I am asking you, not your father, not as a transaction, not under any pressure of debt or 60-day clauses that I can extend indefinitely at my own discretion. I am asking you specifically whether you would consent to be my wife." She turned around. He was standing at the other side of the room, hat in his hands, the same hat he'd taken off in the stable yard the first morning, the gesture she'd categorized then as old-fashioned. She understood now it wasn't old-fashioned. It was just him. It was how he was. She looked at him for a long time. "I have conditions," she said. Something shifted in his face, not surprise, not resistance. Relief, she thought. Like a man who has been hoping someone would say a complicated thing rather than a simple one. "I'd expect nothing less," he said. "I will manage whatever household we have with full authority, not as a courtesy extended by you, but as a right we agree upon before any arrangement is made formal." "Agreed. My family's debt will be settled as a separate matter from this marriage, not as a price for me, not as a thing you hold over anyone. Settled outright and done. Already my intention." "And Eleanor?" She stopped, steadied. "Eleanor will have a portion set aside for her own future. Something that doesn't depend on her marrying well. Something that is hers." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is a generous condition on your sister's behalf." "She is afraid," Charlotte said simply. "She has been afraid for 3 years, and she handles it badly, and she is still my sister." Carrington looked at her across the room with the expression she'd been trying to categorize since the first morning in the stable yard. She had it now. It was the expression of a man who has been looking for something specific for a long time and has unexpectedly found it. "Yes," he said, "to all of it." Charlotte nodded. The decision had been made. The hard thing had been looked at and not looked away from, and it had turned out to be not only hard, but also unexpectedly a great deal like relief. "Then I accept," she said. Carrington let out a breath that was quieter than a sigh. but held the same weight, a long-held thing released. "There is one more thing," Charlotte said, "before we go any further." "Name it." "I need to tell Eleanor myself," she said. "Not you, not my father. Me." He nodded. "Of course." "Today." "Today." He agreed. She straightened her shoulders, the same small movement she made every morning when she got up to check whether the kitchen roof had held through the night, the practiced gesture of a woman who had learned to meet the day before the day decided to meet her. "Then wait here," she said, and she went to find her sister. Eleanor was in the garden. Not the kitchen garden, the small flower garden their mother had kept in better years that Eleanor sometimes went to when she wanted to be somewhere. Their mother's presence still lived in the things she'd planted. Charlotte found her there with her hands at her sides and her face turned up to the summer morning, and her copper hair loose because it was still early and they were still at home. She heard Charlotte's footsteps on the path and turned, and one look at Charlotte's face told her everything. She did not cry. That surprised Charlotte a little. Eleanor, who cried beautifully and strategically, and sometimes genuinely stood in their mother's garden and did not cry. "Tell me," Eleanor said. Charlotte told her. All of it: the note, Carrington owning the debt, the conversation in the sitting room, the conditions, the answer. She told it plainly, the way she always did, because Eleanor, under everything, deserved the plain version. When she finished, Eleanor was quiet for a long time. "He bought the debt before he came," Eleanor said. "Yes." "He was always going to settle it." "Yes." Eleanor looked at the roses their mother had planted 8 summers ago. "So, I was never the choice, was never really—" She stopped. "The choice was real," Charlotte said. "He didn't know which of us he would choose when he arrived. He chose based on what he saw." "He saw you," Eleanor said. "Yes," Charlotte said. "He did." The word landed between them and sat there honest and irreducible. Eleanor pressed her lips together. She turned and looked at Charlotte with the real face, the one that rarely came out in rooms full of people, unguarded, tired, and surprisingly clear. "Is this what you want?" Eleanor asked. "Not what we need. Not what saves the North Fields. What you want." Charlotte held her sister's eyes. "Yes," she said. Eleanor nodded. A single, slow nod, the kind that is less about agreement and more about the final closing of a door that has been standing open for too long. "Then I'm glad it's you," Eleanor said, and her voice only broke a little on the last word. "I mean that." Charlotte crossed the path and put her arms around her sister, which was something she had not done in years. They were not, as a general rule, a demonstrative family, and Eleanor stood rigid for a moment and then held on with both hands, the way people hold on when they are more frightened than they want anyone to know. "You are going to be all right," Charlotte said quietly. "You don't know that," Eleanor said into her shoulder. "No," Charlotte said. "But I know you. And you handle hard things better than you think you do." Eleanor pulled back. Her eyes were bright but dry. She smoothed the front of her dress with the automatic gesture of a woman restoring her presentation, and Charlotte felt a rush of affection for her so strong it was almost painful. "Go back inside," Eleanor said. "Your practical man is waiting." Charlotte almost smiled. She turned and walked back up the path, and behind her she heard Eleanor make a single small sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Something in between. And then the garden was quiet again, except for the sound of summer and the distant complaint of the cricket in the dry grass, and the world moving forward the way it always did, indifferent and relentless and full somehow of the possibility of things turning out differently than you feared. The announcement was made on a Wednesday. Richard Hayes gathered what remained of his social circle, the Aldertons, the Marshes. 2 neighboring families whose names carried more weight than their finances currently warranted, and Mrs. Hewitt from the inn, who was invited because she knew everything that happened in the county, and it was better to have her inside the room than outside it. And he stood in the Hayes parlor with a glass of good bourbon that Carrington had quietly arranged to be present, and he announced the engagement of his eldest daughter to Mr. Jonathan Carrington, of Carrington Hall, Shenandoah County. The room received this information in several different ways simultaneously, Mrs. Alderton's face went through 4 distinct expressions in approximately 2 seconds before settling on warm congratulation, which was the correct social response. And also Charlotte noted the one that would allow her to depart with the most useful information to distribute later. Dr. Marsh shook Carrington's hand and then Charlotte's and said, "Well, that makes sense," in the satisfied tone of a man whose private assessment has been publicly confirmed. Eleanor stood at the edge of the room, in a dress the color of late summer wheat, and smiled with a steadiness that cost her something Charlotte could see and no one else in the room was positioned to notice. She had done her hair simply. She had worn no jewelry. She looked, Charlotte thought, genuinely beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with performance, and Charlotte felt the complicated weight of her sister's grace press against her ribs. The 2 neighboring families exchanged glances of the kind that travel fast and land hard in social circles, the recalibration of every assumption they'd held about which Hayes' daughter mattered. Charlotte stood beside Carrington and received congratulations with the same composed directness she brought to everything. And when Mrs. Alderton clasped her hands and said, "My dear, we had no idea you've been so quiet about the whole thing," Charlotte said. "There wasn't much to be loud about until there was." And Mrs. Alderton laughed the way people laugh when they're not entirely sure whether they've been complimented or outmaneuvered. Carrington, standing close enough that his arm nearly touched hers, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough and was definitely directed at her. "Well managed," he said under his breath. "I've had practice," she said. The week that followed was practical in the way that major life changes are practical when you are Charlotte Hayes, full of lists and logistics and the particular work of transitioning a household from one state to another. Carrington rode back to Shenandoah to begin the legal arrangements with Briggs, who would handle both the debt settlement and the marriage contract. He was gone 4 days. Charlotte found to her mild irritation that she noticed his absence with a specificity she hadn't anticipated, not painfully, but the way you notice when a piece of furniture has been moved and you keep almost reaching for it in the old place. She used the 4 days to be useful. She sat down with Eleanor. Not the conversation in the garden, a different one, a practical one, because Charlotte had promised Carrington that Eleanor would have a portion set aside, and she intended to be the one who told her sister directly rather than letting it arrive through legal paperwork. Eleanor listened to her explain it without interrupting. When Charlotte finished, Eleanor was quiet for a moment and then said, "You negotiated that, specifically, for me." "Yes." "Before you accepted him?" "Yes." Eleanor looked at the table between them. Her hands were still in her lap the way they went when she wasn't performing anything. "Why?" "Because you're afraid," Charlotte said. "And you shouldn't have to be." Eleanor pressed her lips together. She had the expression of someone receiving something they're not sure they deserve and have not been given enough practice accepting gracefully. "I haven't been," Eleanor started. "I know I haven't always been." "Eleanor." Charlotte's voice was not unkind. "I'm not doing it to settle a score. I'm doing it because you are my sister and because I can." Eleanor nodded, then very quietly, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Charlotte said. "Use it. Make something real with it. Something that doesn't depend on a man making the right choice about you." Eleanor looked up at her with an expression that was half wounded, and half Charlotte thought something closer to the beginning of a different kind of thinking. "You really don't see yourself the way other people see you," Eleanor said. "I see myself accurately," Charlotte said. "That's exactly what I mean," Eleanor said. Charlotte let that sit there and went to make dinner. Dig. Carrington came back on a Friday, and with him came the first piece of information that changed everything Charlotte thought she understood about what she was walking into. He arrived with a man she hadn't met, a solicitor named Hart, lean and precise, who carried a leather satchel with the careful manner of someone transporting documents of consequence. They came into the sitting room, and Carrington introduced Hart, and then looked at Charlotte with an expression she'd learned to read in the past 3 weeks as his version of preemptive honesty, the face he made just before saying something complicated. "There are things about Carrington Hall you should know before we finalize anything," he said. She sat down. "Tell me." What he told her took the better part of an hour. Carrington Hall was not simply a large estate. It was a large estate with a substantial number of tenant families, 31 households, who had been managed for the past 6 years by a man named Gerald Whitmore. Whitmore had been Carrington's estate manager since Carrington inherited the hall at 22, when he'd been young enough to trust a man his father had recommended and old enough to be embarrassed about needing to. Whitmore was efficient. He kept excellent books. He was also, as Carrington had discovered 8 months ago, through a combination of a trusted tenant's confession and a discrepancy in a grain account that didn't survive close examination, systematically overcharging the tenant families for their leases while recording the correct amounts in Carrington's books and pocketing the difference himself. Charlotte listened to this without speaking. "How long?" she asked when he finished. 6 years, Carrington said. "Possibly longer." 31 families, she said. "Yes." "Paying inflated rents for 6 years to a man who answered to you?" Carrington held her gaze. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment, not with anger, with assessment. "And you've known for 8 months?" "I've been building the case," he said. "Whitmore is careful. Careful men don't go easily. Hart has been compiling the documentation. We're close." "But not finished." "No." Charlotte absorbed this. "You're telling me this now," she said, "before the marriage contract is finalized. You could have waited until after." "I could have," he said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you told me you don't handle dishonesty by omission any better than the direct kind. And because what I'm going to need at Carrington Hall is someone who understands the scope of what needs repairing, not someone who arrives expecting a functioning estate and discovers the truth in pieces." He paused. "I am not asking you to walk into a comfortable life, Charlotte. I'm asking you to walk into a difficult one with full knowledge of what it is." The room was very quiet. Hart was looking at his satchel with the careful neutrality of a man paid to be present and not to have opinions. Charlotte thought about the Hayes estate's rotted fence posts and broken roof and depleted well, and the 3 years she'd spent holding it together with intelligence and refusal, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who doesn't have the option of looking away. "What does Whitmore know?" she asked. Carrington's expression shifted. "About the investigation. About you coming here, about the marriage, about what's changing." Carrington was quiet for a moment. "He knows I'm engaged. He doesn't know the case is as advanced as it is." "Then he'll move," Charlotte said. "When word reaches him, and it will reach him, Mrs. Alderton will see to that within a week he will start covering his tracks, or destroying records, or both." She looked at Hart. "How much more documentation do you need?" Hart glanced at Carrington, who nodded. "We have the grain account discrepancy solidly documented," Hart said. "What we lack is a direct comparison between what the tenants were actually charged and what Whitmore recorded. We have testimony from 2 tenants, but Whitmore's attorney will challenge their credibility. We need the original receipt books." "Where are they?" "Whitmore has them. He keeps the tenant payment records himself rather than having them centrally filed, which is itself part of the scheme," Charlotte said. "He controls the only comparison point." "Yes," Hart said. He was looking at her with the expression of a man recalibrating his estimate of a situation. "Can you get them through legal process?" she asked. "It would take time we may not have," Carrington said. "If he destroys them." "Then we need to get there before he knows to destroy them," Charlotte said. She looked at Carrington. "When did you plan to return to Shenandoah?" "I had thought after the marriage contract was signed. 2 weeks. That's 2 weeks for Mrs. Alderton's information network to outrun us." Charlotte stood up. She was thinking the way she thought when the roof was leaking, and the farrier was unavailable, and the cart horse needed shoeing in sequence, in order of urgency, without panic. "Can Hart go ahead today if possible? Go to the tenants directly, not to collect testimony, just to ask them to hold their own payment records. Any receipts they kept themselves. Most families keep receipts even when they're not asked to. It's the instinct of people who've learned not to trust the official version." Hart looked at his satchel, and then at Carrington. "She's right," Carrington said, "about the receipts. I've seen it," Charlotte said. When our foreman left Hale, some of the tenant farmers on our east boundary kept their own copies of every transaction because they didn't trust the transition. Those copies saved us a dispute with the Alderton land claim 2 years later. She looked at Hart. People who have been paying extra for 6 years without understanding why almost certainly have their own records. They just don't know those records are evidence. Hart closed his satchel with a decisive sound. I can be on the road within the hour, he said. He looked at Carrington. With your instruction. Carrington looked at Charlotte. She looked back at him. Go, Carrington said to Hart. Today. Hart left. The sitting room held only the two of them and the considerable weight of what had just been decided. You understand, Carrington said, that when Whitmore finds out, and he will not simply accept it. No, Charlotte said. Men like that never do. He has connections in the county, people who owe him things. He will use them. I know. She met his eyes. I've dealt with men who use influence as a shield before. My father's creditor Crane didn't sell that note out of pure financial calculation. He sold it because my father failed to manage the relationship, and Crane decided to make a point. She paused. Whitmore will try to make a point too. The question is whether we have the documentation before he realizes he needs to start making it. Carrington was looking at her with the expression she'd first seen in the stable yard and had been trying to categorize for 3 weeks. She had it fully now. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying something heavy alone for a long time and had just had someone walk up and take the other end without being asked. Charlotte, he said. Yes. I am very glad. He said that you came to find me in the sitting room and told me you wouldn't step aside. She felt something warm move through her, not overwhelming, not dramatic, just clean and sure. I'm glad I decided to tell you, she said. The marriage contract was signed 8 days later. It was a straightforward document in legal terms, and an extraordinary one in practical terms, because Charlotte had read every line of it and negotiated 3 specific clauses that Briggs had not included in his original draft. The first gave her co-signatory authority on all estate accounts above a certain threshold. The second established Eleanor's portion as a separate irrevocable settlement already funded, requiring no future action from any party. The third was a single line that Briggs had looked at with mild bewilderment, and Carrington had signed without comment, in all matters relating to the management of Carrington Hall and its tenant households. Charlotte Hayes. Carrington shall have equal authority with her husband. Equal. Not advisory. Not granted at his discretion. Equal. Her father signed the contract with the expression of a man who has been watching a situation he barely understood resolve itself in ways he could not have managed, and is experiencing the complicated emotion of relief, mingled with the minor humiliation of having been less essential than he'd imagined. Her mother cried, genuinely quietly with one hand pressed over her mouth, not the performative tears that sometimes accompanied her anxiety, but something real and releasing, and Charlotte sat beside her after the signing was done, and held her hand, and said nothing, because sometimes nothing was the right thing. Eleanor witnessed the document with a steady signature and a straight back. Afterward, when the solicitors had gone, and their father had retreated to his study, and their mother had gone to lie down, Eleanor found Charlotte in the kitchen. Always the kitchen. Always Charlotte at the kitchen table, when the significant things happened, and she set a small package on the table between them. "What is this?" Charlotte asked. "Open it." Charlotte unwrapped the paper. Inside was a small ledger book, fine leather, with Charlotte's initials pressed into the cover. Not the initials Charlotte Hayes, the initials CHC. Eleanor had ordered it before the contract was signed. Charlotte looked up at her sister. "You're going to need a proper account book for Carrington Hall," Eleanor said. "A new one, not a patched-up one, not a salvaged one." Her voice was steady and her eyes were bright, and she was holding her own hands together in the familiar gesture that meant she was keeping herself very controlled. "You should start as you mean to go on." Charlotte ran her thumb across the pressed initials. "Eleanor," she said. Don't make a thing of it, Eleanor said quickly. I mean it. Don't. Charlotte set the ledger down and stood up and put her hand on her sister's face, a gesture she hadn't made since they were small children, and Eleanor went very still. You are going to be extraordinary, Charlotte said. When you stop trying to be what rooms expect and start being what you actually are. Eleanor's composure slipped just slightly, just for a moment. Then she recovered it. That's easy to say from the position of someone who never tried to be what rooms expected. I know, Charlotte said, but you don't have to do it anymore. Eleanor covered Charlotte's hand with her own for a moment. Then she stepped back and straightened herself and said, When do you leave for Shenandoah? 10 days. Then I have 10 days to teach you how to enter a room properly, Eleanor said, and the corner of her mouth moved. Because I've seen how you do it, and it's frankly alarming. Charlotte almost laughed. The sound surprised her. I enter rooms just fine. You enter rooms like you're checking a fence line, Eleanor said. It is not the same thing. The night before she left, Charlotte did what she'd done every morning for 3 years. She walked the property. Not to check for problems, or not only for that. To know it. To hold it in her mind the way she'd held it through the droughts and the debt and the slow erosion of the things her parents had built before she understood what erosion meant. She checked the east fence line, which was solid. She looked at the kitchen roof, which had not leaked in 6 weeks. She stood at the edge of the north fields in the dark summer night and listened to the silence of land that was no longer threatened, and she felt the peculiar emotion of a thing you fought for, arriving safely at a shore you weren't sure you'd reach. Her father found her there. He came across the field in his old boots and stood beside her without speaking for a while, and they both looked at the north fields in the dark, the way the Hayes family had been looking at them for 3 generations, with the mixture of love and anxiety that is specific to land you might lose. Charlotte, he said. Father. He was quiet. Then, I should have told you about Crane's claws. From the beginning. I should have told both of you. Yes, she said. You should have. I was ashamed, he said, of the position I'd put us in, of needing. He stopped. A father shouldn't need his daughters to rescue him. Charlotte looked at the north fields. You didn't need rescuing, she said carefully. You needed someone to hold things together while you found your footing again. That isn't the same. She paused. But you have to stop not reading the difficult letters, Father. Promise me. He made a sound that was half a laugh and half something more painful. You'll be in Shenandoah. I will, she said. But Thomas will still be here. And Eleanor is more capable than you've ever given her credit for, now that she's not spending all her energy trying to charm her way into a safe harbor. She looked at him. Let her help you. Actually help you, not just arrange flowers for your guests. He nodded. It was the nod of a man who had received more honesty in the past month than he'd allowed himself in 3 years. And who was, Charlotte thought, possibly beginning to understand that honesty, even the uncomfortable kind, had a structural integrity that avoidance never did. I'm proud of you, he said. I don't say it enough. No, she agreed. You don't. He winced slightly. You're not going to let me be sentimental, are you? I'm letting you be honest, she said. That's better. He put his arm around her, a gesture from her childhood, from the years before. The debt had made him smaller in himself, and she let herself lean into it for a moment, just a moment before she straightened and looked back at the north fields. Go to bed, Father, she said. I'll be up early. He went. She stayed until the last of the summer dark held still around her, and then she went inside and set her traveling case by the door and slept better than she had in years. Carrington came for her at 6 in the morning. He was on time, which she'd expected. He helped load her case himself, which she'd also expected. He handed her up to the carriage with the formal courtesy of a man who understood the weight of the moment and chose not to undercut it with false lightness. Her mother held her hands on the front step and said nothing, which meant everything. Eleanor stood one step back, composed and dry-eyed, and Charlotte caught her eye, and Eleanor gave a single small nod. Not a farewell nod, but a "you're ready" nod, the kind that passes between people who understand each other at the level below words. Charlotte got into the carriage. Carrington got in across from her. The door closed. The carriage moved. For a while they rode in silence, which was their natural register, and neither of them had ever been uncomfortable in it. The road north was dry, and the fields on either side were the deep, exhausted green of late summer, and the morning was already warm. "Hart sent word this morning," Carrington said after a while, "about the tenants. 14 families had kept their own receipt records," he said. 14 out of 31. Hart has copies. Charlotte felt something settle solidly in her chest. "That's enough." "More than enough," Carrington said. "Whitmore doesn't know yet." Hart moved quietly. He paused. "You were right about the receipts. People who've been treated unfairly usually keep evidence," she said. "Even when they don't know it's evidence. It's the instinct of people who've learned they might need to prove the truth someday." He looked at her across the carriage with the expression she had finally completely named. It was not admiration exactly, though there was admiration in it. It was the expression of a man who has been understood, not flattered, not performed, for not managed. Simply understood accurately by someone who was paying real attention. "We're going to have to move against Whitmore quickly," she said. "Once we arrive, before he knows the receipt copies exist." "I know. And it will be ugly," she said. "He'll make it ugly. Men like that always do." "I know that too." "I want to be in the room when you confront him," she said. "Not standing behind you. In the room, at the table." He held her gaze. "You will be," he said. The carriage rolled north. Outside, the Virginia summer pressed its full weight down on the dry earth, indifferent and golden. And Charlotte Hayes. No, Charlotte Carrington. Or she would be soon enough sat across from a man she had known for 3 weeks and trusted in the particular way you trust something that has been tested rather than simply promised. And she felt for the first time in 3 years the specific sensation of moving toward something rather than simply holding something together. It felt like ground under her feet. It felt unexpectedly like beginning. Carrington Hall announced itself through the people before it announced itself through anything else. They were half a mile from the main gate when the first tenant family appeared at the road's edge, a man and his wife and 2 children standing still watching the carriage pass, with expressions that Charlotte read in an instant and filed away with precision. Not welcome. Not hostility. Something in between, which was the expression of people who had learned that the arrival of authority brought change, and change had rarely in their experience meant improvement. She did not look away from them. She held eye contact with the woman at the road's edge until the carriage rolled past, and she saw the woman notice that she had, and she saw something shift, not trust, not yet, but the small adjustment that happens when someone realizes they have been seen rather than looked through. "They're afraid," Charlotte said. "They have reason to be," Carrington said. 6 years of Whitmore. "They're afraid of us," she said. "Not just him, of what we represent." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, then the first thing we do is not confront Whitmore," she said. "The first thing we do is be visible. Ride the tenant road. Meet people. Let them see you are present and I am present, and we are paying attention." She looked at him. Whitmore's power came from being the only face of authority these people ever saw. We need to change what authority looks like here before we move against him. Otherwise, when he falls, the tenants won't understand who's on their side. Carrington studied her. "You've thought about this since Hart's letter," he said. "I've thought about this since you told me about Whitmore," she said. "In the sitting room, 3 weeks ago." He looked at her with the expression she knew now as his version of being moved, not demonstrative, just deeply quietly present. "All right," he said. "We ride the tenant road first." Gerald Whitmore met them at the hall's entrance. He was a tall man, well-dressed in the manner of someone who had worked hard to look like the kind of man who didn't have to work hard. He had a smile that arrived exactly on schedule and eyes that were doing something different from the smile cataloging, calculating. measuring the new variable that had arrived in the carriage alongside Carrington. Charlotte measured him back. "Mr. Carrington," Whitmore said with the warmth of a man who has practiced warmth until it feels like his own. "Welcome back, and this must be Miss Hayes," Carrington said. "Soon to be Mrs. Carrington." "Of course." Whitmore turned the smile toward Charlotte. "The Hall is very glad to have you, Miss Hayes. I hope the journey wasn't too taxing." "Not at all," Charlotte said. "I'd like to ride the Tennant Road this afternoon if the horses can be arranged." The smile held, but something behind it recalculated. "Of course, though you've only just arrived, perhaps a day to rest." "I'm not tired," Charlotte said, "and I'd like to see the land while the light is good." Whitmore looked at Carrington. Carrington said nothing. He simply waited, which Charlotte had noticed was one of his most effective tools, the refusal to fill silence on someone else's behalf. "I'll have the horses ready within the hour," Whitmore said. "Thank you," Charlotte said, and walked past him into the hall. She spent 3 days on the Tennant Road before she spoke to Whitmore directly about anything of substance. 3 days of riding out in the morning with Carrington, and sometimes without him, stopping at farmhouses and introducing herself and drinking whatever was offered, and asking questions that were not about rent or money or management, but about the land, how the wells were holding, which fields had drainage problems, whether the old mill on the north boundary still functioned. Questions that told people she understood what the land required and was interested in the specific facts of this particular piece of it. By the second day they were answering her fully. By the third day, a woman named Ruth Parson, wife of the longest tenanted farmer on the Hall's land, a woman whose age and permanence gave her a kind of informal authority, among the Tennant families, walked out to meet Charlotte at the fence line of her property and said without preamble, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Charlotte asked. "Someone who'd stay inside," Ruth Parson said. "They usually stay inside. I find staying inside makes it harder to understand what's actually happening," Charlotte said. Ruth Parson looked at her for a long moment, with the appraising directness of a woman who had been evaluating the character of people in authority her whole life and had become very accurate at it. "Whitmore told my husband last week that Mr. Carrington was bringing a wife who'd be managing the household accounts," she said. "Said it wouldn't change anything in terms of tenant business. Said that was still his department." Charlotte held the woman's gaze. "Mr. Whitmore was mistaken," she said. "Tenant business is very much my concern." Ruth Parson nodded slowly. It was the nod of a woman deciding something. "I have my payment ledgers going back 11 years, she said. "Every payment, every date, every amount. My husband thought I was foolish to keep them. I told him I kept them because I was raised by a woman who said that if someone tells you the official record is sufficient, that's when you know you need your own." Charlotte felt the information arrive with the clarity of something she'd known was coming. "I'd be glad to see them," she said carefully. "I imagine you would," Ruth Parson said, and there was a small satisfied weight in the words, the sound of a woman who has been waiting 11 years for someone to say exactly that. The confrontation with Whitmore happened on a Thursday. Hart had arrived the night before with the compiled documentation, the tenant receipts, the account discrepancies, the comparison that made the fraud not just probable, but irrefutable. 14 families' receipt books. Ruth Parson's 11 years of meticulous records. A grain account that didn't survive being placed next to the actual delivery logs. The shape of 6 years of systematic theft assembled into something that could walk into a room and stand on its own. Charlotte had spent the evening reading every document. She had not read them to verify Hart's work, which was solid. She had read them because she intended to know the material better than anyone else in the room the following morning, and because the tenant families whose lives these numbers represented deserved someone who understood the full scope of what had been done to them. By midnight she had it, all of it. Dates, amounts, patterns, the precise mechanism by which Whitmore had structured the overpayments to be individually small enough to avoid notice, but collectively substantial enough to have extracted over 6 years a sum that made her jaw tighten when she calculated the total. She set the last document down and looked at Carrington across the table. He took from 31 families over 6 years, she said. Families who were already stretched, who kept paying because they had no alternative and no recourse. Her voice was even. Her hands were flat on the table. He sat across from them and collected their money and looked them in the face, and they had no idea the number he wrote in his ledger was not the number they'd just paid. No, Carrington said. He needs to be removed, prosecuted, and the overcharges need to be returned, she said. Every family, every year, with interest. That will be a significant sum. Yes, she said. It will be. He looked at her steadily. Agreed, he said. All of it. She held his eyes for a moment and felt the specific quality of partnership, not agreement in the abstract, but agreement about something real and hard and costly, which was the only kind that meant anything. Tomorrow morning, she said. Tomorrow morning, he confirmed. Whitmore came into the study at 9 o'clock with the same practiced smile and the same well-dressed authority he wore like a second coat, and he stopped when he saw the table. The documents were laid out in sequence, not stacked, not piled, arranged, the way Charlotte arranged things when she wanted them to be read in order and understood completely. Hart stood to one side. Carrington stood at the window. Charlotte sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface and looked at Whitmore the way she looked at everything she needed to deal with directly. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "please sit down." He looked at the documents. The smile held for exactly 3 seconds after it should have failed, which was how she knew he understood immediately what he was looking at. He sat down. "We have 14 tenant receipt books," Charlotte said. "We have 11 years of Ruth Parsons' payment ledgers. We have the grain delivery records from the Cromwell supplier going back 7 years. She placed her hand on the first stack. "We have your account books." She moved her hand to the second stack. "The comparison is not complicated." Whitmore's face had settled into something that was no longer smiling, and not yet anything else the face of a man calculating his options in real time. "These are tenant records," he said. "Tenants misremember. 14 families do not misremember in the same direction over 6 years, Charlotte said. And Ruth Parson does not misremember anything. I have read her ledgers. She records in the same hand every time. Date, amount, receipt number, 11 years, Mr. Whitmore. She was keeping these before you arrived." His jaw tightened. "Miss Hayes, Mrs. Carrington," she said. "Not correcting a title, establishing a position. And I'd like you to tell me specifically which of these documents you intend to dispute, so we can address them in order." The room was very quiet. Carrington had not moved from the window. He was letting her run the table, which was what they'd agreed, and which Charlotte was aware required a particular kind of trust from a man unaccustomed to yielding the primary position in a room. She was aware of it, and she did not look away from Whitmore to acknowledge it. Whitmore looked at Carrington. "Jonathan, we have known each other." "You've known my name for 12 years, Carrington said from the window. "That's not the same thing." The words landed flat and final. Whitmore looked back at Charlotte. His calculation had shifted. She could see it, the pivot from denial to negotiation, the move that men like him made when they understood that the exit they'd planned was closed and they needed to find another one. "What do you want?" he said. "I want your full accounting of every overcharge," she said. "Every family, every year, every amount. I want it accurate because we already know what the accurate number is, and if yours doesn't match that, becomes its own evidence." She held his gaze. "I want your resignation in writing effective today. I want the keys to the account office and the tenant files, and I want to know whether there are other accounts, other holdings, other arrangements that belong to this estate and are currently in your name." The last question was the one that broke him. Not the resignation, not the accounting. The last question, because it told him she already suspected there were other accounts, which meant she either had evidence or had reasoned her way to the truth through the pattern of what she'd already seen, and either way, denial was no longer viable. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "There's an account in Richmond," he said. "In my name. It was for estate purposes, expenses." "How much?" Charlotte said. he told her. The number sat in the room like something that had been hidden in a wall for 6 years and was now standing in full light, looking everyone in the face. Carrington moved from the window for the first time. He came to stand beside Charlotte, not in front of her, beside her, and looked at Whitmore with an expression that had no anger in it and no heat, and was precisely because of that more final than either. "Hart will take your full statement," Carrington said. "Charlotte will verify the accounting. You will cooperate completely, or this goes to the county magistrate this afternoon rather than next week." Whitmore looked at Charlotte one more time, a long look, the kind that tries to find a softness or an uncertainty to press against. He found neither. "All right," he said. It took 4 hours. Whitmore gave his statement with the deflated cooperation of a man who has finished calculating and found that all the remaining paths lead to the same destination. Hart documented it in his precise, unhurried way. Charlotte verified each figure against the tenant records page by page, number by number, and when Whitmore's accounting didn't match twice, she corrected it without raising her voice and asked him to initial the correction. He initialed. By 1 o'clock it was done. Whitmore left the hall with his personal belongings and the legal understanding that full cooperation would determine whether his case ended in civil restitution or criminal prosecution. He walked out through the front entrance past 2 of the hall's staff who had known something was wrong for years and had never had the standing to say it, and they watched him go, with expressions that Charlotte would remember for a long time, not triumph exactly. Something more like the release of a breath that had been held too long. She stood in the account office with the tenant files spread across the desk and Hart's documentation stacked in order, and felt the particular exhaustion that comes after controlled intensity, the kind that doesn't arrive until the thing is finished because you can't afford it before. Carrington came in and set a cup of tea on the desk beside her. She looked at it, then at him. "You made tea." "I found the kitchen," he said. He sat in the chair across from the desk, the same posture he'd had in the Hayes sitting room 3 weeks ago, patient and present. "Are you all right?" "I'm tired," she said. "And yes. You were extraordinary in there." "I was accurate," she said, and heard her own word come back at her, and almost smiled. "There's a difference." "There's a difference," he agreed, and the corner of his mouth moved. She picked up the tea. It was too strong and slightly too hot, and exactly what she needed. "The tenant families need to know today," she said. "Before anything else. Before word gets out through other channels. They should hear it from us directly, what was found, what it means, what we intend to do about the overcharges." "This afternoon," he said. "Can you ride with me?" "I wouldn't miss it," he said. "Yeah, Ken." They rode to the Parson farm first. Ruth Parson came out to meet them before they dismounted, and Charlotte wondered if the woman had been watching the road, which she suspected she had. Charlotte told her plainly. Whitmore's statement, the Richmond account, the full scope of the overcharges, and Carrington's commitment to restitution for every family, every year with interest. She told it, in order, in the same way she'd laid out the documents on the table, because Ruth Parson deserved the full version. When she finished, Ruth Parson was quiet for a long moment. 11 years, the woman said. "I kept those ledgers for 11 years. "You won them," Charlotte said. "They were what made the case unassailable." Ruth Parson looked at her with the full direct attention of a woman who has spent her life being underestimated and has developed an extremely accurate sense of when someone is being genuine with her. "You're going to stay," Ruth Parson said. It was not a question. "Yes," Charlotte said. "And you'll actually manage this land, not from inside." "Not from inside," Charlotte said. Ruth Parson nodded. The long, slow nod of a woman making a decision that has been a long time building. "Then come in," she said. "I'll put water on." They rode to 12 families that afternoon. By the time they returned to the hall, the summer dark was coming on, and Charlotte's back ached from the hours in the saddle, and she was hungry and thoroughly, deeply, cleanly tired, in a way that felt like the right kind. The hall's remaining staff had made dinner. Not because anyone had instructed them to specifically, but because Charlotte understood they had understood that something had changed and were expressing it the way people express things when they don't have words, through the practical language of hot food and a lit table and the small arrangements that say, "We are glad you are here." She sat down at the table across from Carrington and ate and did not talk for a while, and he did not require her to. After a while he said, "Hart will begin the restitution calculations tomorrow." "I want to be involved in the distribution," she said. "Not Hart alone. I want to ride to each family myself with the accounting and explain it directly." "That will take weeks." "Yes," she said. "It will." He looked at her across the table with the steady, uncomplicated attention that she had understood from the first morning in the stable yard was not admiration or assessment, but something more fundamental. The attention of someone who was genuinely, specifically interested in the real version of her, not a performed one. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes, I need to tell you something." She set down her fork and looked at him. "When I came to the Hayes estate," he said, "I had a list. Practical requirements, household management capability, intelligence, stability, the ability to understand what an estate actually needs." He paused. "I had convinced myself that a practical arrangement required only practical qualities." "And," she said, "and I did not account," he said, "for the possibility that the person who met every practical requirement would also be the person who makes the world make more sense when she is in the room." His voice was even not dramatic, the way he said everything, as though he had measured the words carefully and arrived at exactly what he meant. "I did not account for what it would feel like to be known accurately, to have someone see the thing I was actually doing and not the thing it was convenient to believe I was doing." Charlotte looked at him. "You mean the note," she said. "Buying Crane's note." "I mean all of it," he said. "The note, the Whitmore case, every conversation, every—" He stopped. "You never let me present the version of things I'd prepared. You always found the actual version underneath." Something moved across his face, genuine, unguarded. "Do you know how rare that is?" She held his gaze. "I know how tiring the alternative is," she said quietly. "Being in rooms where no one is paying real attention. Doing things that matter and having them disappear because the people around you are looking at something else." She paused. "Yes, I know how rare it is." He reached across the table and set his hand over hers. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. His hand was warm and steady, and the table between them held the remains of a dinner that the hall's staff had made because they were glad the hall had changed. And outside, the Virginia summer night was full of crickets and heat, and the enormous ordinary fact of the world continuing to exist. Charlotte turned her hand over under his. Not a dramatic gesture, not a performance, simply the physical acknowledgement of a truth that had been established, carefully tested honestly, and arrived at by two people who were both, it turned out, more tired of substitutes than they had known. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Eleanor. Charlotte read it at the account desk, where she had been working through the restitution schedule, with a focus and a satisfaction that she was beginning to understand was the feeling of doing exactly the work you are suited to do. Eleanor's handwriting was beautiful, which Charlotte had always known, and the letter was concise, which surprised her. Eleanor had historically leaned toward the elaborate in correspondence. It said, "Father is letting me run the East Field accounts. I told him I'd been watching you do it for 3 years and I knew how." He looked embarrassed. "I told him not to be. I used your method: start with what's urgent, then what's important, then everything else in order. The numbers make sense now. I think they always would have if anyone had asked me to look at them. Also, I am considering an invitation to visit the Harrisburg Marshes in September. Dr. Marsh's nephew is apparently both kind and sensible, which you will say is all that matters, and you will be right, and I resent it." Charlotte read it twice. Then she set it down and went to find Carrington, who was in the stable yard with one of the tenant farmers discussing the drainage problem in the north pasture, with the rolled sleeves and direct attention of a man who had been waiting for years for permission to stop pretending the distance of authority was the same thing as its exercise. She stood at the gate and watched him for a moment before he noticed her. He looked up. The farmer looked up. Carrington said something to the farmer, who nodded, and then he walked to the gate. "Letter from Eleanor," Charlotte said. "She's running the East Field accounts." Something crossed his face that was warm and genuine. "Good." She said father looked embarrassed when she told him she'd been watching me all along. "Also good," he said. Charlotte held the letter in her hand. "I want to ride out to the Parson farm this morning," she said. "I have the final restitution figures for their family. I want Ruth to have them before the week's end." "I'll come with you," he said. She looked at him in the summer morning, this man who had come to her family's estate in plain clothes to see what the world was like when it didn't know it was being watched. Who had reshot a horse and held a woman's honest gaze and bought her family's debt. Not as leverage, but as protection. Who had told her the truth before it was safe to do so, and had sat across a table from a corrupt man and let her run the accounting because it was her table as much as his. "All right," she said. "Get your hat." He got his hat. They rode out together in the full heat of the Virginia summer morning down the Tennant Road, where the families were beginning to understand that authority did not have to mean extraction, that presence did not have to mean threat, that the arrival of the Carringtons meant the ledger was going to be put right, and the fence would be fixed, and someone was going to show up when the well ran low. Charlotte rode beside her husband, her partner, her equal, the man who had said you didn't need it, like it was simply a true thing about her, the simplest kind of respect. And she felt the ground solid under her horse's feet, and the summer opening up ahead of them, and the particular earned satisfaction of a woman who had stopped managing survival and started building something real. She had come to this county as someone's daughter, someone's older sister, the one who handled the difficult letters and fixed the fence and held things together because someone had to. She had arrived at Carrington Hall as a woman who had negotiated her own terms, documented a fraud, and ridden 12 Tennant roads in an afternoon to look people in the face and tell them the truth. She was not finished. There was more to do, more Tennant families to know, more accounts to correct, more of the slow and essential work of repairing what 6 years of dishonesty had broken. There would be difficult seasons and hard decisions.